The letter should have warned her. Not about the cold, though the cold would come for her soon enough. Not about the distance, though she had crossed half a continent on a train that smelled of coal smoke and other people's luggage. Not even about the isolation, though she would learn the true meaning of that word before the first snow finished falling. The letter should have warned her about the three of them. Instead, it had said only this: Hargrove Ranch, Silver Creek, Montana Territory. A woman is needed. Hard work expected. Winters are harsh. Train fare enclosed. $50. More money than Wren Daley had held in her life. And 8 words that told her almost nothing about what she was walking toward. She had taken both. Boston in October smelled like wet brick and desperation. Wren had lived inside that smell for 22 years, first in the stone halls of St. Agnes Orphanage on Waverly Street, then in the 2 rooms above the laundry on Fenn Court that she shared with 4 other women who had aged out of the orphanage the same year she did. They were not friends, exactly. They were survivors of the same institution, which sometimes amounted to the same thing. The orphanage had given her 3 things of value: the ability to sew anything from almost nothing, the habit of waking before anyone else, and a clear understanding that no one was coming to rescue her. She had known since she was 9 years old that love, if it existed at all for someone like her, would have to be earned in the ordinary way, through work and patience and the quiet accumulation of trust. She had no illusions about being special. She had no illusions about much of anything. What she had, at 22, with autumn thinning into something colder, was a choice between 3 futures. Not one of them was soft. The first was Mr. Harland Prewitt, a widower of 58 who had come to St. Agnes not for companionship, but for management. He needed someone to run his household, cook his meals, and be present enough to constitute a wife without requiring anything so inconvenient as being treated like one. He had looked at Wren the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he is considering for a room he has already measured. The second was the textile mill on Aldgate Street, where 3 women from her year at St. Agnes now worked double shifts and had stopped meeting her eyes when they passed on Sunday mornings. She had watched their hands over the course of 1 year, watched what the looms did to fingers that had once been quick and precise. The third was the advertisement she found folded inside the Boston Globe on a Tuesday morning in October when she was sitting in the reading room of the public library because it was warm there, and she had nowhere else to be. Respectable woman wanted for marriage. Hargrove Ranch, Silver Creek, Montana Territory. Must endure isolation. Hard work expected. Winters are harsh. Write to Hargrove Ranch, care of Silver Creek Post. Train fare enclosed upon reply. Montana. She spread the word out in her mind like a map she had never seen. She knew only what she had read, which was mountains, cattle, men who were either building something or running from something, sometimes both at once. She wrote back the same afternoon. She told the truth, because she had no other currency to spend. She was 22. She was an orphan. She knew how to cook and sew and keep accounts. She was not afraid of hard work. She was afraid of very little, in fact, except the future that waited for her if she stayed. The reply came in 11 days. It was short. It was not warm. Ranch needs a woman. Winters are harsh. Fare enclosed. Inside the envelope was $50 and a train ticket to Helena, Montana Territory, departing November 1st. There was something else inside the envelope that she noticed and then forgot, the way you notice a wrong note in a song and then lose it in the next measure. The reply had been written in 3 different hands. Not dramatically different, Not the kind of difference a person would immediately question. But the first line was in one hand, the second in another, slightly heavier, the third in a third, smaller and more careful, the hand of someone who measured words before committing them to paper. She folded the letter. She packed her one carpet bag. She did not look back at the rooms above the laundry on Fen Court when she left before dawn on November 1st, because there was nothing there worth carrying in her memory. The train took 4 days. She ate sparingly from the food she had packed and watched America change outside the window, the way a person watches something they have only read about become slowly real. The flatness of Ohio. The wide gray expanse of the Middle States. Then, on the third day, the first suggestion of mountains on the horizon, so distant they looked painted against the sky. She thought, watching them, that she had made the right decision. She thought this in the careful way she did most things, not with certainty, not with joy, but with the measured conviction of someone who has looked at the available options and chosen the least terrible one. The mountains did not care about her reasoning. They simply grew larger. Helena was cold and smelled of horses and fresh lumber. She hired a wagon driver named Pell, a lean, weathered man of few words who seemed to take her destination as instruction enough and asked nothing more. The road out of Helena climbed steadily. The sky was the color of old pewter. Trees closed in on both sides, pines so tall their tops disappeared before she could follow them with her eyes. They passed through Silver Creek just after midday. It was a small town, the kind that existed because the land required it rather than because anyone had chosen it. A general store, a post office, a church with a crooked bell tower that listed slightly eastward. A handful of houses pressed close together as though for warmth. People moved along the boardwalks, and Wren watched them without being watched in return, until the wagon slowed near the post office and a woman in a dark wool coat stopped and looked up. She was perhaps 60, with a face that had opinions in it the way some faces carry wrinkles. Permanently and without apology. She looked at Wren, then at the wagon, then at Wren again with the deliberate attention of someone taking inventory. "You the one heading up to Hargrove Ranch?" "Yes, ma'am." The woman's expression shifted into something Wren could not immediately read. Not hostility, not pity. Something older than either of those things. Something that had been waiting to form an opinion on this subject for a long time. "You're the bride, then. Their bride. Their, not his. Their." Wren opened her mouth to ask what that meant, but Pell had already clicked the horses forward, and the woman, Mrs. Adeline Vetch, though Wren did not yet know her name, stepped back onto the boardwalk and watched them pass with an expression Wren would think about for a long time afterward. Something between judgment and prayer. She told herself she had misheard. The wind had been picking up. There was a strange word to use, perhaps a grammatical habit, perhaps nothing at all. She did not think about it again until the door of the cabin closed behind her, and she understood that she had, in fact, heard exactly right. The storm came when the wagon was still half a mile from the ranch. Not gradually, the way storms sometimes announce themselves with a drop in temperature or a shift in the smell of the air. This one arrived like a decision, fully formed, as though it had been waiting behind the tree line for her specifically. Snow drove sideways. The temperature fell 10 degrees in minutes. The horses leaned into the wind, and Pell said nothing, which Wren understood to mean that this was normal, that this was simply what this place was, and she would either accept it or she would not. She accepted it. She had, by that point, very little choice. The cabin appeared out of the white, first as a shape and then as a structure, solid and low, with a stone chimney pushing orange light up into the gray sky. Pell pulled the horses to a stop and helped her down without ceremony, handed her carpet bag across, and pointed at the door. "They're inside," he said. She walked toward the cabin. The wind was loud enough that she could not hear her own footsteps. She pushed the door open. She stepped inside. The door swung shut behind her with the weight of the storm at its back, and the latch caught, and outside the world became snow and wind and nothing else. Inside, a fire burned in a stone hearth wide enough to park a wagon. The room was warm. Shelves of books lined one wall. Tools hung in careful rows on another. The kitchen shelves were stocked with preserved jars, flour, meal, and dried herbs in small labeled tins. It did not look like the lair of dangerous men. It looked like a home that had been tended by people who understood the difference between order and comfort, and who had been, for some time, waiting for something to make it feel less like the former and more like the latter. And then she saw them. 3 men stood across the room. Not cousins, not brothers who merely resembled each other in the way families sometimes do. One taking the father's jaw and another the mother's eyes. 3 identical men. Tall, broad across the shoulder, dark-haired with the kind of darkness that had copper in it when the firelight caught it right. Eyes the color of amber, the warm brown of oak wood in autumn, watching her with the same expression on 3 separate faces, careful, measured, uncertain in a way they were working hard not to show. Wren did not move. The man closest to her stepped forward. He moved the way people move when they are accustomed to being responsible for everything in a room, steadily, without hesitation, as though responsibility were simply weather he had learned to navigate. His voice was low and carried no apology in it. "Miss Daley, I'm Cormac Hargrove." He gestured to the man at his left. "My brother Stellan." He gestured to the man at his right, who had not moved and did not appear to intend to. "My brother Birch." The other 2 inclined their heads. Same height, same build, same amber eyes, same hands, large and rough with the kind of work that changes a person's shape over years. Triplets. Wren heard from somewhere distant the sound of her own breathing. "Brothers," she said. The word came out quietly. The way you say something when you are confirming what you already know, but had hoped was wrong. Cormac nodded once, the gesture of a man who has had this conversation before, and found no better way through it than straight. "We run this ranch together." Outside, the wind found some new pitch, something higher and more purposeful, as though it had heard the silence in the room and decided to fill it on their behalf. Wren looked at each of them in turn, not with panic, not with the bright, performative shock that the situation might have invited in someone else. She looked at them the way she had always looked at difficult things, steadily, taking inventory, trying to understand the shape of what she was dealing with before she decided what to do about it. Cormac looked back at her without flinching. Stellan watched her with the careful attention of a man who is listening for something specific, something beneath the words being said. Birch looked at the floor, not from shame, she would understand later, from the habit of a man who has learned that watching too closely is its own form of wanting, and wanting had not served him well. "You didn't mention brothers," she said. The silence that followed lasted long enough to hear a log shift in the fire, Stellan spoke. His voice was smoother than Cormac's, the voice of someone accustomed to precision. The advertisement said, Hargrove Ranch. I assumed there was one Hargrove. That's a reasonable assumption, Stellan said, and we should have corrected it. Birch said nothing. He had not moved since she entered. Cormac crossed to the short hallway that led to the back of the cabin. He picked up her carpet bag from where she had set it and carried it without being asked. Your room is this way. He led her to the last door. He opened it. The room was small and clean, with a quilt on the bed. A thick, heavy thing with an intricate pattern that had taken someone with skilled hands a very long time to make. There was a candle on the table beside the bed, already lit and burning steadily. On the windowsill, in a small tin cup, sat a careful arrangement of dried wildflowers, mountain aster and dried columbine, placed with deliberate attention. Cormac set her bag inside the door and reached into his coat pocket. He held out a key, iron and worn smooth with years of handling. This locks from the inside, he said. Use it. Every night. He said it not as a warning, but as a statement of fact. The way you tell someone where the water pump is, or which direction faces south. A piece of practical information about how things worked in this house. Wren took the key. Its warmth surprised her. He had been holding it for some time before she arrived. Who put the flowers there? She asked. The question surprised him. She watched it happen, a slight shift around his eyes, there and gone before it could become anything. They were there, he said. He turned and walked back down the hallway, and Wren stood in the doorway of a room that smelled of cedar and old wood smoke and something else she could not name. Something careful and preserved. Something that had been waiting longer than she had. She closed the door. She turned the key in the lock. She listened to the storm press itself against the window glass like something that wanted in. Then she sat on the edge of the bed, and the quilt shifted under her weight, and she noticed on the bedside table a book, small, leather-bound, dark with age and handling. She picked it up. It was a Bible. She almost set it back down. Then she opened it. On the first inside page, in handwriting that was not recent, small and careful and deliberate, the hand of someone who had chosen every word before setting it down. Someone had written, "For the woman with courage enough to love all 3 of my sons. They are worth it. I promise you they are worth it. Nora Hargrove." September 14th, 1879. Wren read it twice. She sat with it for a long moment, the book open in her hands, the storm outside pressing at the glass, the fire somewhere down the hall making sounds she could hear even from here. September 14th, 1879. 3 years ago. The woman had written this 3 years ago. She had prepared this room, placed this book, arranged those flowers, and then waited for someone to come and find it. She had not lived to see whether anyone would. Wren had not had a mother. She had had matrons, several of them over the years, varying degrees of competent and occasionally kind, but none of them had ever written anything for her to find. None of them had prepared a room with dried flowers and a key that locked from the inside, and a note that said, "They are worth it. I promise you, they are worth it." The words had a weight to them she was not prepared for. They assumed a future for her. They assumed she was the kind of person deserving of such a promise. She sat with that for a long time. The storm outside was doing what storms do, filling every available silence with its own noise, and the fire down the hallway was doing what fires do, pushing back against the cold with patient insistence. She could hear, faintly, the low murmur of voices. 3 men, 3 different registers, building a conversation out of the space between what they were actually saying. She had lived in institutions her entire life. She understood the architecture of shared space, the grammar of proximity without intimacy, the way people learn to exist alongside each other without ever quite touching. Street. Agnes had been full of people who were technically never alone and were, in every meaningful sense, always lonely. This felt different. She pressed her palm flat against the quilt. The fabric was dense and warm, the batting inside thick enough that she could feel it give slightly beneath her hand. Someone had made this with care. Someone had chosen these colors, this pattern, this weight. Someone had sat in this room or near it and made something that would keep a person warm. She thought about the word home. She had used it in her letter to them, had written, "I am looking for a home." But she had used it the way you use a word when you know its definition without having its referent, the way you might describe a color you have only seen in pictures. She was beginning to suspect she might learn the referent here. She was also beginning to suspect that it would cost her something, and that the cost would be worth paying. She had always been good at calculating worth. She closed the Bible carefully. She set it back on the table beside the candle. She looked at it for a long moment, then looked at the window, where the snow had thickened to the point where she could no longer see anything beyond the glass, only white and the ghost of her own reflection looking back at her. She had come to Montana looking for safety. She had come looking for a future that would not grind her down before she reached 40. She had not expected this. Outside, the storm deepened. Inside, down the hall, she could hear low voices. The sound of 3 men who shared a language made of half-sentences and long silences, negotiating something she could not yet hear clearly enough to understand. She did not unlock the door that night, but she held the key in her hand for a long time before she slept, and she thought about the woman who had written in the margins of a Bible 3 years before Wren arrived. As though she had known, as though she had seen something coming from a great distance that no one else could see yet. 3 sons, 3 blessings, 1 woman with enough courage to receive them. Wren set the key on the table beside the Bible. She lay back on the quilt. Above her, the ceiling of the cabin was rough timber, darkened with years of smoke and weather. Outside, the mountains were somewhere in the white, waiting. Silver Creek was somewhere below, with its crooked church and its curious residents, and a woman named Ottoline Vetch, who had used a plural where a singular should have been. Wren Elspeth Daley, 22 years old, most recently of Boston, Massachusetts, late of St. Agnes Orphanage, survivor of that institution and every cold thing that had followed it, closed her eyes. She did not know yet what this place would ask of her. She knew only that she was here, and the door behind her was locked, and the storm was outside rather than in, and for the first time in a very long time, she was warm. That, she decided, was enough to begin with. Morning came without announcing itself. No gradual lightening of the sky, no birdsong, no slow warming of the air that might ease a person into consciousness. The storm had continued through the night, and the world beyond the cabin windows was still white and featureless, the kind of white that erases distance and makes everything feel both closer and further away than it actually is. Wren was already awake. She had been awake since 4:30, lying still in the dark with her hands folded on the quilt, listening to the sounds of the cabin. She had learned this habit at St. Agnes, where waking early meant the difference between hot porridge and cold, between a quiet hour at the sewing table and noise that made concentration impossible. She had kept the habit long after the circumstances that created it had ended, because the early hours had become hers in a way no other hours were, and she was not willing to give them back. What she heard in those early hours told her something. At 4 o'clock, the back door of the cabin opened and closed, boots on frozen ground, moving toward the barn. One set of footsteps, deliberate and unhurried. Someone who knew this path so well they did not need to think about it. At 4:15, a second set, lighter on the boards but equally sure. At 4:40, a third, slower, and this one stopped once just outside the cabin, paused for a moment in the dark as though deciding something, then continued. 3 men, 3 different rhythms, 3 different ways of beginning a day. Wren rose at 4:50. She dressed in the dark, the way she had learned to dress when the dormitory lights at St. Agnes were not permitted before 5. She folded her nightgown with the same automatic neatness she brought to everything, set it on the chair beside the bed, picked up the iron key from the bedside table, and unlocked the door. The hallway was empty. The fire in the main room had been banked low, but not extinguished, and the room held enough warmth that the cold from the hallway did not reach the bones. She built the fire back up with wood stacked beside the hearth, laid the larger pieces with the care of someone who has learned that heat is not a given, that warmth must be tended or it disappears. She found the kitchen and got to work. The food she made that first morning was not complicated. It was not meant to impress. It was what she had learned to make at St. Agnes when the matron handed her a limited inventory and told her to feed 37 people without waste, salt pork and dried beans, biscuits from the flour she found in the tin on the second shelf, gravy made from the drippings. Simple food, the kind that fuels a body through hard, cold work without asking anything of it in return. She had the table set and the food hot when the back door opened at 6:15, and all 3 of them came in from the barn together. They stopped when they saw her. Not stopped walking exactly, but the slight hesitation of people who have encountered something that does not match their expectation of a room. Cormac recovered first. He hung his coat on the hook by the door, moved to the wash basin, worked the pump. Stellan followed. Birch came last, and Wren noticed that he did not look at the table or at her, but at a spot on the floor just to the left of the door, the way people look when they are orienting themselves inside a change they have not yet decided how to feel about. They sat. They ate. The silence was not uncomfortable exactly. It was the silence of people who do not yet have a language for each other, who are eating around the edges of a conversation none of them knows how to begin. Stellan broke it, not with anything that reached toward warmth, but with the practical directness of someone who has been thinking since before the food arrived. "You didn't have to do this." "I know," Wren said. "We've been managing our own meals." "I know that too." She refilled his coffee without being asked. "I wasn't doing it for you. I was awake, and the kitchen was there." Stellan looked at her across the table, not with challenge, with assessment, the careful look of a man who is listening for something that words alone cannot convey. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked. "St. Agnes Orphanage, Boston." She sat down with her own plate. "I was cooking for 37 people by the time I was 12. You learn to make something out of very little, or you learn to go hungry. I chose the first." She said it plainly, without asking for sympathy, without the slight softening that some people add to difficult histories to make the listener more comfortable. It was a fact. She presented it as one. Stellan was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and took out a small notebook, the kind with a dark cover and pages thin enough to see light through, and wrote something in it with the focused attention of a man recording something he does not want to forget. Wren watched him without asking what he was writing, because something in the way he held the pen told her the answer would come in its own time. Birch ate without speaking. He had eaten half his plate before either of his brothers touched theirs, the efficiency of a man who views meals as fuel rather than occasion. But when Wren pushed the biscuit plate toward him without comment, he took one without looking up. A small thing. It was still something. In those first days, Wren watched. She had always been good at this, at moving through a space without disturbing it, at gathering information the way you gather kindling, a piece at a time, building a picture before you commit to a shape. It was another skill from St. Agnes, from years of learning which matrons were strict and which were merely tired, which silences in a room meant peace, and which meant something about to break. The three Hargrove brothers moved through the ranch with the efficiency of men who had been operating as a single unit for so long that the joints of their collaboration were invisible. Cormac carried the heaviest work without discussion. When a fence post needed replacing in the north pasture, he went. When a horse was spooked by the storm and kicked out a section of barn wall, Cormac was the one who rebuilt it, working alone in the cold, with the steadiness of someone who does not find physical discomfort particularly remarkable. He did not ask for help. He did not complain about not receiving it. He simply worked until the thing was done, and then moved to the next thing. Stellan managed everything that required precision, the feed ratios for the cattle, the accounts in his neat, careful ledger, the inventory of supplies measured against the length of the winter that remained. He was the one who knew exactly how much flour was in the tin, and exactly how long it would last, and exactly what would need to happen in which order if the storms continued past February. He spoke in specifics and did not deal in approximation. Birch worked without explanation. He was the quietest of the three and the most difficult to read, not because he concealed himself deliberately, but because he seemed to exist at a frequency slightly different from ordinary conversation. He was extraordinary with the animals. Wren watched him lay a hand on the neck of a horse that had been agitated since the first storm, and the horse went still in a way that had nothing to do with force. It was something older than training. The animal simply trusted him, in the complete and non-negotiating way that animals trust the few people in the world who truly understand them. She spent those first days learning the language of the ranch the way she had learned every other language available to her, through observation and careful repetition and the willingness to be wrong before she was right. She learned that Cormac always checked the eastern fence line before breakfast, not because it was the most vulnerable, but because it faced the graves. And she understood that this was how he began every day, with acknowledgement rather than avoidance. She learned that Stellan's ledger was not simply a financial record, but a kind of diary, that the numbers he tracked included weather patterns and livestock health, and the precise dates of every snowfall and thaw, as though he were building a case for something, though she could not yet determine what the case was for. She learned that Birch talked to the horses in complete sentences, never in the diminutive way people talk to animals when they think no one is listening, but in the full and careful way of someone who genuinely expects to be understood and is generally not disappointed. She learned, too, the particular cadence of evenings in that cabin. After dinner was cleared, which they all did together without discussion, falling into positions that suggested long habit, the room settled into its nighttime character. Cormac would sit near the hearth and work on whatever needed mending: harness leather or frayed rope, or the wooden handles of tools worn smooth with use. He worked with the meditative steadiness of a man who finds repetitive physical tasks genuinely restful rather than merely occupying. Stellan would retreat to his notebooks, sometimes writing, sometimes reading from one of the books whose spines were marked with slips of paper, occasionally making a sound that conveyed either agreement or skepticism depending on slight variations in pitch that she was learning to read. Birch would sit near the window and whittle. Small shapes, mostly. She could not always tell what they were intended to be, and she had come to understand that she was not always meant to know. Wren would sew. She had brought thread and needles from Boston, had packed them first before the extra dress and before the letters of character that the matron at St. Agnes had written for her. She had brought a small piece of unfinished work, a simple sampler in cross-stitch, not beautiful, but something to do with her hands during the long train journey west. On the 5th evening at the ranch, she took it out. No one said anything, but over the course of the next half hour, she noticed that Birch had turned slightly in his chair so that he could see her work from the corner of his eye, and that Stellan had looked up from his notebook twice with the expression of a man cataloging something for later consideration, and that Cormac had paused in his mending at least once and looked at her hands with an expression she could not yet read, but filed away for when she could. She kept her eyes on the fabric and let them look. Every morning, before the light was properly up, Birch walked to the far side of the barn. He always carried something small in his hand, dried flowers most days, occasionally a few sprigs of something cut from beneath the snow. He stopped beside a small wooden marker at the edge of the yard, stood for a moment with his head bowed, then went back to his work. Wren noticed. She did not ask. She had learned that questions asked too soon closed doors that would have eventually opened on their own. On the 8th evening, the storm gentled enough that the windows held something other than white. Wren could see the outline of the mountains for the first time since her arrival. Dark shapes against a sky that had gone the deep, bruised blue of very late dusk. She stood at the kitchen window for a long moment, looking at them. She heard Birch come in from the barn and stop behind her. Not close, but close enough that she knew he was looking at the same thing. "They're called the Cairn Range," he said. It was the most he had said to her that was not directly functional. "The tallest one is Harrow Peak. You can't see it from here in summer because the trees are too full, but in winter it shows above everything else." Wren looked at where he was pointing. A long shape against the dark sky, broader than the others, with a notch at the top like a crown that had been worn down by weather over a very long time. "It's beautiful," she said. Birch did not answer, but he stood there for another minute before he went to the wash basin, and that minute felt like something offered. A small door opened just wide enough to let light through. On the 10th night, a horse got sick. She heard it at 2 a.m, a sound from the barn that pushed through the storm noise, something low and rhythmic, the labored cough of an animal in distress. She lay still for a moment, expecting to hear boots in the hallway. She heard none. She got up. She dressed. She took her coat from the hook and went out the back door into the cold that hit her like a physical object, and crossed the yard to the barn. Birch was already there. He was sitting in the straw beside the horse, a bay gelding with a white blaze down his face and eyes that held more intelligence than most, one hand resting on the animal's neck. The horse lay on its side, breathing in the labored, effortful way of something fighting for air it cannot quite reach. Birch looked up when she came in, but he did not tell her to go back inside, which she took as permission to stay. She found the tin pail near the barn door and filled it from the pump, set it close enough that the horse could reach it without being asked to move. She found a grain sack and folded it into something approximating a cushion and sat down on the other side of the horse from Birch. They did not speak for a long time. The wind moved through the gaps in the barn walls. The other horses shifted in their stalls, restless but not frightened. The sick horse breathed. "He'll be all right," Birch said finally, not as reassurance, as information, the quiet certainty of someone who knows what they are reading when they read an animal. "I know," Wren said. She did not know, but she understood that he did. And that was the same thing in this moment. Another silence, long enough that the candle on the beam above them burned down a full half-inch. "This horse," Birch said. He paused, as if he were deciding whether the words were worth the air they required. "He's the last one from our father's original herd. The others went one by one. Weather, age. One we had to put down after a fence accident." His hand moved slowly, steadily along the horse's neck. "When he goes, that's the end of something. I don't know what to call it." Wren watched his hand move and understood that this was not a complaint. It was not even grief, exactly. It was the kind of thing a person says when they finally find someone who can hold a piece of their life without putting it down prematurely. "What's his name?" she asked. "Capper." The shadow of something moved across Birch's face. "My father named him." Wren nodded. She did not say anything that began with "at least," or "you still have the others," or "he's had a good life." She said nothing at all, because the only useful thing in that moment was silence, and she knew it. She sat with him until the horse's breathing steadied, sometime past 4 in the morning. When she finally rose to go back inside, Birch looked up at her. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, quiet and complete. She went back to her room and lay down on the quilt with her coat still on, and she thought about the way Birch had said "when he goes, that's the end of something," and the wooden marker at the edge of the yard, and the flowers he brought to it every morning without explanation. She thought about what it meant to love something so completely that you have no language for the losing of it. She thought about this for a long time before she slept. Douglas Crane came on the 18th day. The knock at the door was hard and deliberate. 4 knocks evenly spaced. The knock of a man who expects the door to open and has not seriously considered the alternative. Wren was at the table with Stellan's ledger, going over the winter supply accounts at Stellan's invitation. She was good with numbers. She had always been good with numbers. All 4 of them froze. No one traveled in this weather. Not up this mountain. Not in this season. The fact of someone at the door was itself a kind of threat. Cormac rose and took the rifle from its place above the door with the unhurried practicality of a man who has learned to treat certain preparations as manners rather than alarm. He opened the door. The man who stepped inside was perhaps 50, with the kind of build that had once been powerful and was now expensive. The thickness not of labor but of comfort and certainty. His coat was good wool, His boots were good leather, and the snow on both was minimal in a way that suggested he had not traveled through the storm so much as moved alongside it, waiting for a gap. He pulled off his gloves one finger at a time, looking at each of them in turn, taking inventory the way a man looks at something he is planning to acquire. His eyes stopped on Wren. "The rumors were accurate," he said pleasantly. "You found someone willing." "State your business, Crane," Cormac said. The rifle was still in his hand, not raised, not threatening, simply present. Douglas Crane moved to the table without being invited and set down a folded document he had produced from his coat pocket. He smoothed it once with his palm, the gesture of a man who enjoys presenting things. "Your note is due the 1st of March, he said. $3,000. I've run the numbers on your herd, your winter, and your history with the Helena Bank." He paused, and the pause had a performance to it. A beat held slightly too long. "You won't have it." "We'll have it," Stellan said. "Partial payment doesn't count. The contract is explicit." Crane glanced around the room with an expression of mild appreciation, the look of a man admiring a property he has already mentally measured and found satisfactory. "The water rights along Silver Creek are worth more than your debt 3 times over. I want those rights. You give them to me, I wipe the note clean. Entire obligation gone." "No." Cormac said it the way you close a door, firmly, completely, without leaving a gap. Crane smiled the smile of a man who has not yet started playing his real hand. He turned toward Wren. "You might want to think carefully about your situation here, Miss Daley." He said her full name precisely, the way people say names when they want you to know they have done their research. A woman alone, in an irregular arrangement, far from any town. The territorial courts take an interest in these things. Wren did not look away from him. She had spent 22 years around people who used information as a weapon, matrons who knew your history and were not above reminding you of it, women in the laundry house who watched for weakness the way cats watch for mice. She recognized the method. She was not afraid of it. "The only irregular thing I've seen in this room," she said, "is a man who rode up a mountain in a blizzard to threaten people in their own home." Something moved behind Crane's eyes. Not anger, recalibration. He pulled his gloves back on, one finger at a time, the same deliberate way he had removed them. "1st of March, he said to Cormac. "Not a day beyond." He left. The door shut behind him. Outside, the wind filled the space he had occupied. The room was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet that follows something that matters. After the door shut, no one moved for a long moment. The fire settled in the hearth. Outside, the wind reclaimed the yard. Inside, the 4 of them stood around the residue of what had just happened, and Wren noticed each of them absorbing it in their own way. Cormac was near the door with the rifle still in his hand, his jaw tight in the way of a man who is choosing his next action very carefully before he commits to it. She had seen that expression on him before, in the brief seconds between a decision and its execution. He gathered himself and then moved. That was what he did. The only question was always what kind of movement he chose. Stellan had set the document back on the table and was looking at a point slightly above and to the left of it, the way people look when they are doing calculations in their heads and have temporarily lost interest in the physical world. Birch was looking at the fire. She understood something in that moment about the 3 of them that she had not fully understood before. They were not one person divided into 3 bodies. They were 3 separate people who happened to carry the same face, and the differences between them were not surface differences of temperament or mood, but deep differences of character that had grown in the same soil and come out shaped by their own particular roots. Cormac gathered himself and then acted. Stellan gathered information and then reasoned. Birch observed and then waited, patiently, for the right moment to say the one thing that needed saying. She thought, this is what a family looks like when it has had time to become itself. Then Stellan crossed to the kitchen cupboard and opened the lower cabinet and reached behind the flour sacks and took out a second ledger, smaller than the first, its cover dark with years of handling. He set it on the table beside the one Wren had been working from. He opened it to a page near the middle. Wren looked at the numbers. She looked at them long enough to understand what she was seeing, which did not take as long as it should have. The note was not $3,000. With the penalty interest written into the original contract in language dense enough to miss on a first reading, the compounding calculation applied from the date of the first missed payment. The true balance was $3,820. She looked up at Stellan. He met her eyes without flinching, but something in his face had shifted. Some carefully maintained surface had developed a crack in it, the crack of someone who has held a weight alone for too long. He doesn't know you know the real number, she said. No. How long have you known? 4 months. And Cormac? Stellan was quiet. She understood then. She looked at Cormac, who was still standing near the door with the rifle in his hand, watching his brother, and she saw in his face the precise moment he understood what he was looking at. The number, the second ledger, the 4 months of silence. Stellan, his voice was very quiet. Cormac. Stellan did not look away. You have lost enough. I was not going to put that number in your hands until I had a plan to go with it. The silence between the two men was not empty. It was full of years, full of the specific weight of brothers who have lived through the same losses and found different ways of carrying them. Birch stood at the edge of the room and watched his brothers and said nothing, but his hands, hanging at his sides, had closed into fists and then opened again, slowly, the way hands open when a person is making a decision about whether to hold on or let go. Wren looked at the number in the ledger. She looked at the quilts folded on the shelf near the window, thick and precise and beautiful, the work of a woman with skilled hands and a long winter and a love that had survived her. 6 of them, each one a different pattern, each one made with the kind of care that makes a thing last generations. She reached out and touched the edge of the nearest one. The fabric was soft in the particular way that good work gets soft over time, worn to its best self rather than its worst. She had been sewing since she was 8 years old. She had made quilts at St. Agnes for the charity sales that kept the orphanage funded through its hardest years. She had sold her work to shops on Tremont Street for 2 years before she left Boston. She knew what she could make, and she knew what it was worth in the right room to the right people. She looked at the number. She looked at the quilts. There was, in her memory, one additional detail Stellan had mentioned in passing the previous week while explaining the accounts. A name underlined once and never crossed out. A woman in Helena named Aldrich, Constance Aldrich. She had purchased 6 of their mother's quilts in 1881 and promised $800 in return. The money had never arrived. Stellan had written twice, no reply. Wren stored the name away. She thought about the auction houses in Helena, the hotels with their charity galas, The wealthy women in silk dresses who collected fine needlework the way they collected everything else. Not because they needed it, but because beautiful things made by skilled hands were worth something that money could measure, even if the making of them could not be. She did not say anything yet. It was not time yet, but the idea was there, clear and solid, the way a good plan feels before it becomes action, before the cold reality of execution tests whether the courage behind it is real. Outside, the wind was already beginning to pull at the corners of the cabin, announcing the next storm with the same indifference it announced everything. Inside, 3 men stood around a table with a number on it that none of them had wanted to say out loud. Wren folded her hands on the ledger and looked at nothing in particular and began, quietly and without telling anyone what she was doing, to make the calculations. The morning after Crane's visit, the snow stopped, not permanently. Wren had been in Montana long enough by then to understand that the stopping of snow was not the same as the ending of winter, that the sky cleared between storms the way a person catches their breath between difficult things, briefly and without promise. But for 3 days the world outside the cabin windows was sharp and still and blue-white, and the mountains appeared in full for the first time since her arrival, enormous and indifferent and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have no interest in your opinion of them. She stood at the window the first morning and looked at them for a long time. Then she went to find Stellan. She found him in the small room at the back of the cabin that served as his office, a room she had not entered before. It was the most personal space she had seen in the house, not in the way of sentiment, but in the way of accumulation. Every surface held something in use. The desk was covered in papers, organized by a system she could not immediately decode, but could recognize as a system rather than disorder. Books were stacked on the floor along 2 walls, not decoratively, but practically. Their spines marked with slips of paper, their margins visible from the door as dark with careful annotation. The small stove in the corner had been burning for hours. The room smelled of paper and ink and the particular warmth of a space that a person inhabits completely, that a person has made entirely their own in the absence of anyone who might ask them to be otherwise. Stellan was at the desk when she knocked on the open door. He looked up without surprise, which told her he had heard her coming. "I need to talk to you about the number," she said. He set down his pen. "Sit down." She sat in the chair across from him, the chair that was clearly not his, placed at an angle that suggested it was for occasional visitors rather than regular use. She folded her hands in her lap. "You kept it from Cormac for 4 months," she said. "I understand why. But I need you to tell me everything now. Not the simplified version. Everything." Stellan looked at her for a moment. Then he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and took out a folder of papers and set it between them. Everything took 40 minutes. She listened without interrupting, which she could see he noticed. He walked her through the original loan, taken out by their father in 1878, to expand the herd before the hard winter of 1879 that killed a third of the cattle, and then took their father in February of 1880, worked down by grief and cold, and the relentlessness of the land. He walked her through the penalty clauses, written in language designed to be skimmed, the kind of language that assumes the reader will not look carefully enough. He walked her through the 4 months of calculations he had done and redone in this room, trying to find a combination of cattle sales and supply reductions that would reach the number. There was no combination. She already knew this by the time he finished. "There's one more thing," he said. He opened a separate page near the back of the folder. A woman in Helena purchased 6 of our mother's quilts in 1881 and promised $800 in return. The money was never sent. I wrote twice. No reply. He pointed to a name underlined once and never crossed out. The name is Aldrich, Constance Aldrich. Wren noted the name. She would remember it. You were accepted to medical school, she said. The shift in him was subtle and immediate. A slight straightening, a careful settling of the expression, as though he were adjusting his posture against a weight he had learned to carry at a specific angle. St. Louis College of Physicians, he said. 1876. You didn't go. Our father died in February of 1880. I was meant to leave in September of 1876. He paused. Those dates don't match. I should clarify. I chose not to go in 1876, before my father died. Cormac had lost Anna and Rose the previous winter. Birch was 18. The ranch was already struggling. He straightened a paper on the desk that did not need straightening. It was not a difficult decision. It was the most difficult decision you ever made, Wren said. He looked at her sharply. You don't have to make it sound like nothing, she said. It doesn't make you weak to admit that it cost you something. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a true thing lands in a room and neither person is quite sure what to do with it. Stellan reached into the top drawer of his desk and took out an envelope. Old. The paper had gone soft with handling. The kind of soft that comes from being folded and unfolded many times over many years. Each fold a small decision renewed. He set it on the desk between them without opening it. She did not need to ask what it was. I keep it because it reminds me what I chose, he said. Not to punish myself. To remember that it was a choice, that I had agency in it. He paused. Some days that distinction matters more than others. Wren looked at the envelope. She looked at the man across the desk from her, who had built a life around the decision not to leave, who managed the numbers and the accounts and the careful architecture of keeping 3 men and 1 ranch alive through seasons that were trying very hard to end them, and who had done all of it without, as far as she could tell, ever once asking anyone to acknowledge the cost. What's in the notebook? She asked. The one you write in at meals. Something moved through his expression. There and gone, faint as weather on glass. Observations, he said. About what? A pause. About what I notice. She waited. He opened the notebook to a page near the middle and turned it toward her. The handwriting was the same careful hand as the 3rd line of the letter she had received in Boston. Small and precise, and covering the page in the diagonal way of someone who has learned not to waste paper. She read the line he had pointed to. She is not afraid of very little. She is afraid of being unnecessary. Those are completely different fears, and they require completely different responses. Wren read it twice. She looked up at him. You wrote that on the 3rd day, he said. It's accurate, she said. I know, he said. That night, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. Wren was aware of it before she was fully awake, the particular quality of cold that comes through walls and glass and insulation alike when the thermometer falls past a certain point, the cold that is not just absence of warmth, but presence of something else, something with weight and intention. She put on her heaviest shawl and went to build up the fire. She did not hear Cormac until she was already in the main room, and by then he was already outside. The back door was standing slightly open, not open in the way of carelessness, but in the way of someone who had gone through it quickly and not waited for the latch to catch. She crossed the room and pushed it open, and the cold was immediate and total, and the yard was very bright under a sky packed with stars, the kind of sky you only see when the air is cold enough to have been scrubbed clean of everything that softens it. Cormac was at the fence. He was standing at the long fence along the eastern edge of the yard, the fence with the posts he had sunk himself, the fence that ran between the main yard and the small plot of ground beyond it, where 2 wooden markers stood in the snow. He had no coat. His hands were on the top rail, and his head was bowed and his shoulders were up, not against the cold, but against something else, something inside. She went out. The snow was deep enough that her boots found it before the ground, and she moved carefully. He heard her coming but did not turn. She came to stand beside him at the fence, close enough that their arms were almost touching, and she looked at what he was looking at. The names were carved into the markers, worn now with years of weather but still legible. Anna Lee Hargrove, 1855 to 1879. Rose Hargrove, 1879. One date. The child had lived too briefly for a second one. The cold was working at Wren's face, her ears, the tips of her fingers inside her shawl. She did not move. Cormac was quiet for a long time, long enough that she began to think he would not speak, that this would simply be what it was, 2 people standing at a fence in the dark and the cold, and that would be its own kind of sufficient. Then he spoke. His voice was very low and level, the voice of a man who was not performing grief but reporting it, as if he were reading from a document he had memorized long ago and was only now allowing someone else to read over his shoulder. Her name was Anna Lee. She had red hair, not the kind of red that fades, the kind that looked different in every light. He paused. She died in December of 1879. Scarlet fever. Rose was born 2 weeks before Anna got sick. She never had a chance to be well and a mother at the same time. Another pause. I couldn't get a doctor. Helena was 2 days in good weather. The weather was not good. Wren stood with him. Rose lived 4 days, he said. She was so small. I held her the whole time because I thought maybe warmth was something I could give her. I don't know if it helped. I've thought about it a great many times, and I still don't know. He stopped speaking. The stars above them were extraordinary, the kind of stars that make a person understand why people used to tell stories about them, because the distance was too great for silence, and the light was too insistent for indifference. I built this fence the week after, Cormac said. I needed something to do with my hands that wasn't just waiting. I used every piece of timber we had. It took 9 days. Stellan brought me food and set it down without talking to me. Birch slept in the barn for the whole 9 days. I think so I wouldn't have to pretend to be all right inside the house. Wren thought about Stellan's careful notebook, about Birch and the horse at 2 a.m, about the way the 3 of them had built over years of shared loss, a private language for loving each other that required almost no words. I haven't been able to look at the window of that room, Cormac said. The room you're in now. For 3 years I have walked past that door and I have not looked at the window. He finally turned his head toward her. In the starlight, his face was very clear. She could see what it cost him to hold all of it, the accumulated weight of 5 years of carrying things without putting them down, of being the one who kept the ranch and his brothers and his own body moving forward through seasons that asked more than any person should be asked to give. And she saw, just below the surface of that weight, something else, something that had not entirely closed. Some part of him that had survived by going very quiet and very still. The way small things survive winter, not by fighting it, but by waiting for the conditions to change. His eyes were wet, not crying yet, but close to it in the way that a sky is close to rain before the first drop falls. I put her things in boxes, he said. I put Rose's things in boxes too. I didn't know what else to do with them. I couldn't throw them away, and I couldn't look at them. So they're in boxes in the back of the closet, and I haven't opened them in 3 years. His jaw tightened. That's not right. I know it's not right. But I don't know how to do it differently. The tear that fell was not dramatic. It was quiet and solitary. The tear of a man who has held back so much for so long that even this small release seems to surprise him. He did not wipe it away. He let it fall. Wren did not say anything that began with at least, or you should, or in time. She did not say anything at all for a long moment, because the only honest response to what she had just been given was silence, and she knew it. Then she said quietly, "Tell me about her." Not Anna Lee, not Rose, just her. And he understood she meant the one who had lived long enough for stories, and Cormac Hargrove, who had not spoken his wife's name aloud in the company of another person in 3 years, began to talk. His voice was rough at first, and then it steadied, and he told her about Anna Lee, who had red hair that changed in different lights, who could outride any man in Silver Creek and chose not to most of the time because she found it more interesting to let them think they were impressive, who had taught herself to read music from a book and could not read a single note but could play 3 songs on the Helena Hotel piano entirely by ear, who had laughed at things that surprised her, who had been, in the estimation of everyone who knew her, exactly what she was, and nothing less. They stood at the fence for a long time. When they finally went back inside, the fire was low, and the cabin was cold, and Wren rebuilt the fire while Cormac sat at the table and said nothing. And that was all right, because some things, once spoken, need a period of quiet in which to settle, in which to find their place in the ordinary air of a room. She went to her room. She stood for a moment at the window. Cormac's window. Anna Lee's window. She looked out at the mountains and understood something she had not understood before about the room she had been given, about the key, about the dried wildflowers on the window sill. The room was not only a room of grief. It was the best of what he had. And he had given it to her on the very first night, before he knew anything about her beyond her name and her willingness to come. She woke the next morning before 4, as she always did, and lay in the dark listening to the cabin. Something was different. She lay still for a moment, trying to locate it, and then she understood. Cormac was in the room adjacent to hers, not moving exactly, but present in the particular way of someone who has been awake for a long time and is not asleep and not quite anything else. She did not knock. She got up and went to the kitchen and built the fire and put water on for coffee, and by the time the water was heating, she heard his door open and his footsteps in the hallway, and then he was in the kitchen doorway, still dressed in yesterday's clothes, which meant he had not slept. She handed him the cup before the water had quite boiled, because close enough was better than nothing, and he looked like a man who needed something warm to hold. He took it. They stood in the kitchen in the dark before 4 in the morning and drank their coffee without speaking, and neither of them said anything about the fence or the markers or the names carved into weathered wood, and neither of them needed to. When the light began to come, Cormac set his empty cup on the shelf. "I used to know how to do this," he said. She looked at him. "The morning," he said. "I used to know how to start it." "You start it by standing up," she said. "You've been doing that right." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he got his coat from the hook and went out to the barn. She watched him cross the yard through the window over the sink. At the fence, he stopped. He stood for a moment, as he did every morning. Then he continued toward the barn. It was the same gesture it had always been, but something in the quality of it had changed. Some small shift in the angle of his shoulders, something that suggested he was carrying the same weight, but had adjusted how he was holding it. Small changes. She had learned over 22 years of paying careful attention to everything around her that small changes were the only changes that lasted. She found Birch the next morning at the small marker behind the barn. She had not planned to ask. She had simply walked that way, and he was there, and he did not seem surprised to see her. "What is it?" she asked, quietly, without pressure. The kind of question that has room in it for no answer. Birch was quiet for long enough that she thought he would not respond. Then, "Dog I had when I was 12. Followed me everywhere for 4 years. Died in the night, and I didn't know until morning." He set down the dried stems he was holding, arranging them with the same care he gave to everything. "I was the only one who knew what he meant to me. Seemed wrong not to mark it." He stood and looked at the small marker for a moment longer. "Some things deserve to be remembered, even if no one else understands why," he said. He walked back to the barn. Wren stood at the marker a moment longer. She understood now the full shape of what Birch had told her in the dark room when he sat in the chair all night. The boy who had been sick alone for 11 days and said nothing when his brothers returned, who had learned early that his particular kind of grief had no audience, and had made his peace with that, who had been tending this small grave for years, not because anyone asked him to, but because he had decided long ago that love deserved a witness even when none was available. She walked back to the cabin. She had quilts to plan. 3 days later, she spread the quilts out on the table. All 6 of them unfolded and laid flat so that the patterns were fully visible in the morning light. They were extraordinary. She had known they were good the first time she looked at them, but seeing them open and together like this, she understood what she was actually looking at. A woman who had spent years at this craft, who had made her peace with long winters by filling them with something beautiful and precise, who had understood instinctively that careful work done in the dark is its own form of hope. She thought about her own hands, about the fact that someone's hands had made these, had held this fabric and pushed this needle and pulled this thread through 1,000 careful movements, and that the result of all those movements was something that kept a person warm. It was a simple transaction in its way, labor in exchange for warmth, but it was also evidence of care. Nora Hargrove had cared enough about people she had not yet met to make things that would outlast her. She thought, "I am going to save this ranch." She thought, "I am going to save it because it was built by people who make things that outlast them, and because a woman I never met thought it was worth saving, and because 3 men in this cabin have been carrying everything alone for so long that they have forgotten there is any other way." She looked at the ledger number. 23 days until the adjusted deadline Crane would eventually present. 3 days to Helena by wagon in reasonable weather. 9 quilts needed, not 6. She could make 9 in the time available if she managed her hours correctly, if she did not waste movement or daylight, if she accepted that sleep was a resource to be rationed the way you ration flour in February. She rolled up her sleeves. She spread the first pattern across the table and found the pencil in her apron pocket and began marking the measurements. Stellan came in from his office and stopped in the doorway, looking at the table. He did not ask what she was doing. He looked at the quilts and the pencil marks and the ledger open beside the fabric, and she watched him run the same calculation she had already run. Because he was fast with numbers, and his mind moved, as she had come to understand, the way hers did, through problems rather than around them. 23 days, he said. Yes. For 9 quilts of this quality. Yes. That requires approximately 16 hours of work per day. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. You'll collapse before you finish. Then we adjust the pace, but we finish. Birch appeared in the doorway behind Stellan, coming in from the barn, still in his work coat. He looked at the table. He looked at Wren. He looked at his brothers. And then Birch, who had in the entire length of her stay spoken fewer consecutive words than most people speak in a single meal, looked at Cormac and said, clearly and without apparent difficulty, "Let her try." 8 words. But the weight of them was different from the weight of 8 ordinary words. They were the words of someone who had spent a long time watching from a careful distance and had decided, with the same quiet totality with which he did everything else, that this was worth the step forward, that she was worth it. Cormac looked at his youngest brother for a moment. Something passed between them that Wren could not translate but could recognize, the shorthand of people who have lived through the same difficult years and do not need full sentences to understand each other. He turned to Wren. "What do you need?" he said. She looked at the fabric on the table, at the pattern marked in pencil, at the window with the mountains behind it, indifferent and steady and enormous. "Light," she said. "Enough wood to keep the fire high, and someone to make sure I eat." Cormac nodded once. "Then we start tomorrow," he said. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing, and the mountains held the light the way they always held it, as though they were keeping it safe until someone needed it. She began before sunrise. The cabin was still dark when Wren lit the 2 candles she had set on either side of the work table the night before, positioning them at the angles that would give her the most light without casting shadows across the fabric. She had rearranged the table itself, pulling it closer to the window so that when the daylight came, it would fall directly on her work. She had organized the fabric by color and weight, the thread by color and thickness, the needles by gauge in a row along the edge of the table, like a small, precise army waiting for orders. She had done all of this the previous evening after the others had gone to bed, moving quietly in the near dark, because preparation was its own form of discipline, and she did not want to waste the first light of the first morning on anything except the work itself. She threaded the first needle by candlelight. She began. The days that followed had a shape she recognized. She had lived inside shapes like this before. At St. Agnes during the weeks before the charity sale when every girl who could hold a needle was set to work, the days narrowing down to a single task that consumed the available light and most of the available self. There was a particular quality to those days, not unpleasant exactly, more like the feeling of being entirely used, of having no space left over for anything that was not the thing in front of you. She worked 16 hours the first day. Her fingers ached by mid-morning and were numb by early evening, not from cold, but from the repetitive precision of the work, the same small movements performed hundreds of times until the muscles stopped questioning them and simply complied. The quilt she was making was not simple. She had chosen patterns that matched the quality of Nora Hargrove's work, intricate geometries that required exact measurement and absolute consistency, patterns that would hold up to the scrutiny of women who collected fine needlework and knew the difference between skill and approximation. There was no point in bringing something to a Helena auction that would be assessed and found wanting. The work had to be extraordinary, or it was nothing. The quilts had personalities. She had not expected this, but it was true. Each one, as it progressed from measured cloth to assembled sections to finished object, developed a quality distinct from the others. Some combination of the pattern she had chosen and the colors she had selected, and the particular pressure of her hands on the needle during the days and nights she worked on it. The first was precise and cool, a lone star pattern in blues and grays that reminded her of the Montana sky in early morning. The second was warmer, a flying geese pattern in the ochres and russets of autumn, made during a cold snap so severe that the window glass had grown a crust of ice on the inside, and the contrast between the warm colors of the fabric and the frozen world outside had given her something she recognized as joy. The third and fourth were more somber. She had been tired during those days, working through a hand cramp that she treated with the arnica salve Stellan left beside her candles without comment, and the patterns she had chosen reflected something of that tiredness. A cathedral windows design in deep greens and near blacks that was beautiful the way difficult things are beautiful, with an effort visible in it. The fifth was the one she almost lost. It had been the 12th day, and she had been working by poor light, the sky outside having gone the flat gray of a system moving in, and she had made a cut 3/4 of an inch off true on a section of the border that she did not catch until she had already sewn it into place. She had sat with it for a long moment, looking at the slight irregularity, and then she had unpicked the entire section and begun again from the marked line, because the women who would bid on this work would know the difference between a piece that was almost right and a piece that was right, and she had not driven across a continent and remade her entire life in order to bring something almost right to a Helena ballroom. She unpicked it and began again. It took her an extra day. The 6th was faster. The 7th and 8th she made with a kind of controlled velocity, the speed of someone who has found their rhythm and is no longer fighting the work but working with it. The 3 brothers organized themselves around her without discussion. Cormac took on every task that would have ordinarily required more than one person, working with the single-minded efficiency of a man who has found a problem he can solve with his body and is grateful for the clarity of it. The woodpile beside the cabin grew to twice its usual height. The animals were fed and the yard was clear of the snow that fell each night by the time Wren raised her eyes from her work each morning. Stellan managed the supplies with the precision of a general managing a campaign, adjusting the food stores, tracking the weather through the barometric instrument he kept on the shelf in his office, calculating how many viable working days remained before the next major storm system moved through. He set food beside Wren at regular intervals without commenting on whether she had eaten the previous offering, simply replaced the empty plate with a full one and returned to his own work. Birch kept the fire. This was not a task anyone had assigned him. He simply did it, moving to the hearth at regular intervals throughout the day and evening with the same quiet attentiveness he brought to the animals, reading the fire the way he read everything, through close observation and the willingness to respond before a problem became urgent. The cabin stayed warm. Wren's candles were never allowed to burn below half their length before new ones appeared beside them. She noticed all of it. She did not comment on any of it. The noticing was its own form of gratitude, and she thought they understood that. One morning she noticed on the wooden frame of the window where she sat to sew each day, something small carved into the lower corner. 2 letters, WD, neat and careful, no larger than a thumbnail. She ran her finger over them. She did not ask who had done it. She did not need to. On the 10th night of sewing, Birch found her. She had not intended to fall asleep at the table. She had intended only to rest her eyes for a moment, to let them recover from the close work before she continued with the border of the 4th quilt, which required a precision that tired eyes could not reliably deliver. She had folded her arms on the table and lowered her head, and the next thing she was aware of was being lifted, not startled, not jolted, simply moved with a steadiness and care that suggested the person doing it had thought about how to do it without waking her and had then done exactly that. By the time she had assembled the language for protest, she was already in her room, already on the quilt, and Birch was pulling her shawl up over her shoulders with the same hands that could calm a frightened horse in 30 seconds. She opened her eyes. He was already moving toward the chair near the door, settling into it with the quiet economy of someone who has decided to stay and sees no reason to make an announcement of it. "You don't need to sit with me," she said. Her voice was rough with sleep. Birch said nothing for a moment. The candle on the bedside table had burned low, and the room was mostly dark, the kind of dark that makes honesty easier. "Year I was 14, he said. "Cormac and Stellan went to Helena with our father to sell the autumn cattle. 3 weeks. I stayed to manage the animals." He paused, the long Birch pause that she had learned to wait out. "I got sick on the 4th day. Fever. I couldn't keep water down. I thought about going for help, but the nearest neighbor was 7 miles, and I wasn't sure I could make it on a horse without falling off." Wren was fully awake now. "I lay in that cabin for 11 days, he said. "I didn't tell them when they got back. There was nothing to tell by then. It was over." Another pause. "But I remember every hour of those 11 days. The specific quality of being ill and alone, of not being sure anyone would know if something happened." The candle flickered. Outside, the wind made its steady sound against the cabin walls. "I remember thinking," Birch said, "that the worst part was not the sickness. It was not knowing if I mattered enough to be missed before it was too late to matter." Wren looked at him across the dim room, at the man who spoke to horses because horses did not require you to perform wellness, who left flowers at a small grave every morning without explanation, who had said, "Let her try," with a weight behind the words that his brothers had immediately understood. "You matter," she said. It was a simple thing to say. It was also, she understood from the silence that followed, not a simple thing to receive. "You're the first person outside my brothers who has sat in a barn with me at 2 a.m. and not asked for anything in return," he said. "I wasn't doing it for return." "I know," he said. "That's the part I didn't know how to account for." He stayed in the chair until she slept. She knew because she woke once in the night and he was still there. And she closed her eyes again with the particular ease of someone who has been surprised by safety and is willing, this once, to accept it without questioning it to pieces. The next morning, Cormac set a cup of coffee beside her sewing before she had asked for one. She looked at it. No sugar. A small amount of salt. the way she had been making it since Boston, the way that was entirely particular to her and had never been requested or explained and had certainly never been taught to anyone in this cabin. He had watched her make it every morning for months and had simply, quietly, learned. She looked up at him. He said nothing. He set his own cup on the far end of the table and went back to work. And the not saying was its own complete sentence. Douglas Crane came back on a Tuesday in early February. He came in the afternoon when the light was already going and the temperature was dropping toward the kind of cold that made the cabin walls contract and settle with sounds like distant gunshots. Wren heard the knock and felt the change in the room before she looked up from her work, the way you feel weather shift before you can name the cause. Cormac opened the door. Crane came in with the same performance of ease he had brought the first time, the same removal of gloves, the same deliberate survey of the room. But something was different. He was carrying a document he had not carried before, holding it with the particular care of a man who knows exactly what he has in his hand and has been looking forward to using it. He set it on the table. Wren looked at it from across the room. She could not read it from that distance, but she could read Stellan, who had moved to the table and picked it up and was reading it with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not alarm. Something colder than alarm. The expression of a man watching a trap close. The original contract, Crane said, contains a penalty acceleration clause. Clause 14, subsection 3. In the event of material change in ranch operations or ownership status during the loan period, the lender retains the right to advance the due date by not less than 2 weeks. He folded his hands in front of him with the composure of a man who has rehearsed this moment. The arrival of a new resident at the ranch constitutes a material change in household status under territorial law. He looked at Wren with the expression of a man who has been patient for a long time and is now done with patience. Your new deadline is February 15th. The room was very quiet. February 15th, 11 days away. The Helena auction they had planned for February 7th would still work. The money would still be achievable, but the margin that had been thin became thinner than paper, and any single thing going wrong, weather, a broken wheel, a sick horse, anything at all, would put them past the date with the money still in transit and the ranch forfeit. Crane knew this. She could see that he knew it from the way he was standing, with the relaxed composure of a man who has just moved a piece on a board and is watching his opponent calculate the implications. Cormac read the document. He read it twice. His face did not change. He set it back on the table. He walked to the bedroom hallway and opened the door to his room and went inside and closed it. The sound of something heavy falling. A chair. The specific sound of a piece of furniture meeting a wall with enough force to make the cabin shudder once. Crane observed this with the mild interest of a man watching weather. First and second liens on the water rights transfer to me automatically upon default, he said to no one in particular. Silver Creek feeds 4 downstream properties. Water rights in this territory are worth considerably more than cattle. He pulled on his gloves. Miss Daley, I'd encourage you to consider your options carefully. A woman in your position has more choices than she might think. He left. Stellan and Birch stood in the room without speaking. Birch was looking at the closed bedroom door. Stellan was looking at the document on the table. Wren looked at the closed bedroom door. She crossed the room. She knocked once, courtesy rather than request, and opened the door. The chair was on its side near the far wall. Cormac stood with his back to her, forehead against the timber wall, both hands pressed flat against the wood. His breathing was the controlled breathing of a man fighting himself, the breathing of someone who has learned to treat his own emotions as a weather system that must be managed rather than experienced. She closed the door behind her. "I'll sign the water rights over," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Tonight. And this. No. $3,800 is not a number we can reach. You know that. We have the quilts. We have the auction. If anything goes wrong between here and Helena, we lose everything anyway, and you've destroyed your hands for nothing." He turned around. His eyes were red but dry. "I won't watch you break yourself for a ranch that was already drowning before you got here." Wren stood in the middle of the room and looked at him. She had known men who made decisions about other people's sacrifices with the confidence of someone who has appointed themselves the authority on what is and is not worth the cost. She had lived under that kind of authority at St. Agnes, where the matrons decided what was reasonable to ask and what was reasonable to give, and the girls had no standing in the calculation. She was not a girl at St. Agnes anymore. "That is not your decision to make," she said, not with anger, with the flat certainty of someone stating a property of the physical world. "This ranch is my responsibility, and my time and my hands are mine." She took one step toward him. "You gave me a room with a key. You gave me the choice to lock the door from the inside. You did that on the first night before you knew anything about me. Don't take it back now because you're frightened." Something moved through his face. "I am frightened," he said, not defensively, as a confession, the plain acknowledgement of a man who has decided to stop performing courage and simply tell the truth about what is inside him. "I know," she said. "I am too. That's not a reason to surrender." He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of long that measures something other than time. "You don't have any reason to stay," he said. Not for the first time, but this time it was not resistance. It was something closer to a question, genuine and undefended, the question of a man who has had people leave and has spent years trying to understand what it would take for someone to choose differently. Wren held his gaze. "I have 3 reasons," she said. The words landed the way the right words land, without flourish, without retreat, carrying exactly their own weight and nothing more or less. Cormac said nothing. The fire in the main room made its sounds through the wall. Outside, the temperature was still falling. Somewhere in the cabin, Birch was feeding the fire with the attentiveness he brought to everything he loved. Wren turned and went back to the main room. She sat down at the work table. She threaded a needle. She began the border of the 7th quilt with the same hands she had been using for 3 weeks, aching and precise and refusing to stop. They left before sunrise on February 3rd. The wagon was loaded the night before, each quilt wrapped in oilcloth and packed with the careful density of people who understand that the contents are irreplaceable. Food and blankets for the journey. The horses, the best 2 they had, were checked and rechecked by Birch in the lamplight of the barn while Wren made the final stitches on the 9th quilt, the wedding ring pattern, the last one. She had saved it for last because she had understood from the moment she chose the pattern that it would be the most important and the most difficult. And she wanted her hands at their most practiced when she came to it. She finished it at 11 o'clock at night. She held it up in the lamplight, and it was exactly what it needed to be. She folded it into the oilcloth herself and set it on top of the pile. The mountain at night was a different country. She had seen it in storms, seen it in the flat, bright white of overcast days, seen it in the sharp blue clarity that followed a storm's departure. She had not seen it like this. In the deep pre-dawn dark, with stars so numerous they seemed to be making a sound, a kind of pressure that was almost audible, and the pines on either side of the trail rising like walls into the dark, and the horses' breath clouding, and the wagon wheels finding their way by a kind of animal knowledge that had nothing to do with sight. She sat on the bench beside Cormac and held the oilcloth-wrapped quilts against her side with one hand and held the bench rail with the other and watched the darkness move past. She was not afraid. This surprised her slightly. She had spent most of her life in a low-grade state of anticipatory fear, the kind that does not announce itself dramatically but lives in the background of every decision, the constant awareness that things could go wrong, and that when they did, she would have very limited resources with which to address them. It was a reasonable fear for someone in her position. It had served her well. But sitting on the wagon bench in the dark with 9 quilts and 3 men and a mountain under her feet, she felt something that was not the absence of fear so much as its transformation into something else, something that occupied the same space but had a different quality, something that felt less like caution and more like readiness. She was not afraid because she was not alone. This was new. She turned it over carefully, checking its surfaces, trying to understand what it was and where it had come from and whether it would hold. Behind her, in the dark, she could hear Stellan and Birch on horseback. Stellan's horse had a slightly heavier step than Birch's, and Birch's horse occasionally tossed its head when the wind shifted, a soft, rhythmic sound she had learned over months. She had learned to recognize both horses by their gaits in the same way she had learned to recognize the brothers' footsteps on the cabin floor. By attention and repetition and the gradual accumulation of specific knowledge, she knew these people, not completely, not the way you know someone after years, but she knew them in the way that matters most. She knew what they were made of, what they did when things were difficult, what they protected, and what they could not protect, and where the line between the two fell. She knew Cormac moved toward hard things, because moving toward them was the only way he knew how to honor the people he had lost. She knew Stellan kept secrets not to deceive but to protect, and that the protection was real even when its methods were wrong. She knew Birch understood loss in the particular way of someone who has never had the language to describe it, but has carried it in his body for so long it has become part of his posture, part of the way he moves through the world. She knew these things because she had paid attention, and she knew, sitting in the dark on a wagon bench, with the mountain rising on either side of the trail like the walls of something large and patient, that paying attention was, in the end, the only form of love she had ever fully trusted. The journey down the mountain was slow and difficult. The trail was iced in the night stretches and compacted snow in the day stretches, and the horses needed to be guided with patience through the places where the path narrowed. No one talked much, because the mountain required attention, and the stakes required everyone to be entirely present. On the second day, in a narrow stretch between 2 ridgelines where the wind came through at an angle that pushed the wagon sideways, the left front wheel found a rut buried under the snow, and the axle cracked. The sound was decisive, no ambiguity in it. Cormac pulled the horses to a stop. He sat for one moment with the reins in his hands, and Wren watched him perform, in the space of that moment, the entire calculation, time remaining, distance to Helena, distance back, the temperature and the sky and the horses and the cargo. Then he climbed down into the snow. He worked on his back in the snow for 2 hours. The temperature was 12 degrees below zero by Stellan's reckoning. He did not ask for help with the axle because the space beneath the wagon required one person working alone. But Birch held the horses steady with one hand on each bridle, and Stellan anchored the wagon from the opposite side, and Wren knelt in the snow and held the lantern at the angle that gave him the most light. She held it without being asked. She held it for 2 hours without moving from her position, because the light was what he needed, and her arms, aching as they were capable of providing it. When he finally rolled out from under the wagon and stood, his coat was soaked through with snow and his hands were the color of the sky before dawn. He looked at the axle. He looked at her. She kept the lantern steady. "We can move," he said. They moved. That evening, Stellan wrote in his notebook by the light of the wagon lantern. He did not show her what he wrote. Later, much later, she would find that page. It said only, "She held the lantern for 2 hours in 12 degrees of cold, without being asked and without complaint. She held it steady the entire time. I do not know what to do with that, except write it down." They reached Helena on the evening of the 3rd day as the last light was leaving the sky, and the lights of the city appeared below them in the dark like something from a dream, or a promise, or both. Wren looked at them from the wagon bench and felt, for the first time in 23 days, something that was not determination or calculation or controlled fear. She felt something that had no practical use whatsoever and was, for exactly that reason, completely necessary. She felt hope. The Continental Hotel smelled of beeswax candles and money. Wren had never been inside a building like it. The lobby had a ceiling high enough to lose the light in. Chandeliers that scattered it back down in pieces across polished floors, and the silk shoulders of women who moved through the space with the ease of people who had always inhabited rooms built to impress. She stood in the entrance in her wool dress, the one she had worn on the train from Boston, washed and pressed, but still what it was, a practical garment made for endurance rather than occasion. And she felt the distance between her world and this one with the particular clarity that comes from standing at an exact border. She did not let it touch her. She had spent 23 days making something extraordinary from almost nothing. She knew what she had brought into this building. The room could assess her if it wanted to. She would assess it right back. The auction was held in the East Ballroom, arranged with the quilts displayed on long tables draped in white linen. Each one opened fully so the patterns were visible from a distance. When Wren and the 3 brothers carried them in that morning, the woman overseeing the event, a brisk, silver-haired organizer named Mrs. Dunbar, had unfolded the first quilt and held it to the window light and been quiet for a moment longer than her efficiency usually permitted. "These are remarkable," she said. "They need to sell," Wren said. Mrs. Dunbar looked at her. "They will." The bidding began at 2 in the afternoon. The room was full. Silk dresses and polished boots, and the low murmur of people who had come expecting to find things worth acquiring. Wren stood at the edge of the room with Cormac to her left and Stellan and Birch behind her, and she watched the first quilt go up on the display stand and felt the room change in the way rooms change when something genuinely good enters them. The bidding opened at $50. A hand went up immediately, then another. The number climbed with the steady momentum of something that has found its level and is still rising. 100, 140, 180. The gavel came down at 210. Wren exhaled once, quietly. The second quilt, 200. The third, 240. The fourth, 280, contested by 3 bidders who wanted it badly enough to make it interesting. The room had found its rhythm now, the particular energy of an auction going well, where people who had not intended to bid were leaning forward with the involuntary attention of people being surprised by wanting something. The fifth quilt went for 320, the sixth for 300. By the seventh, word had moved through the room the way word moves in small spaces, quietly and completely. The stitching rivaled anything from the Eastern workshops. The patterns were original. The woman who had made them was standing at the edge of the room in a wool dress and had not moved and had not spoken, and was watching the proceedings with the attention of someone who has wagered everything on the outcome. Several people turned to look at her. She looked back without expression. The eighth quilt, 340. Then the ninth was lifted. The wedding ring pattern. Wren had made it last because she had understood from the beginning that it was the most important and had saved her best work for it. The finest thread, the most precise geometry, the kind of craft that announces itself to anyone with eyes to see it. It caught the light from the chandeliers and held it, the interlocking circles of the pattern creating a depth that flat fabric had no business creating. The room went quiet. The auctioneer opened at 200. 300 came immediately. Then 350. Then 400 from a woman in the third row who had not bid on anything else all afternoon and had been watching the quilts with the focused attention of someone waiting for the specific thing she came for. 450. 500. Silence. 540. The gavel came down. Wren did not move. She was calculating before the sound finished, running the numbers with the speed she had always had with figures. The total was $2,960. She needed $3,820. The silence that followed her calculation lasted perhaps 4 seconds, which was long enough for Cormac's hand to find hers without either of them planning it, his fingers closing around hers in the way of someone who has made a decision and is holding to it, regardless of outcome. She felt the roughness of his palm, the warmth of it, and she did not pull away. She was already looking for another path, because that was what she did. When movement came from the corner of the room, a woman rose from her chair. She was perhaps 65, dressed well but not extravagantly, with the posture of someone who had once cared very much about appearances, and had recently decided that caring was more effort than it was worth. She moved through the seated guests with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who has decided on a course of action and is not interested in being talked out of it. She stopped at the auctioneer's table. She set down $860 in a leather fold. She did not look at Cormac or Stellan or Birch. She looked at Wren. "My name is Constance Aldrich," she said. Her voice was steady and carried no performance in it. "I purchased quilts from your mother, Mrs. Hargrove, in 1881. She was promised $800. That money was redirected without my knowledge, redirected to a man who used it to purchase your family's debt." A pause. "I have known about it for 14 months. I told myself it was not my responsibility to correct." She looked at the leather fold on the table. "I was wrong about that." The room was very quiet. Wren looked at Constance Aldrich for a long moment, at a woman who had carried something heavy for 14 months and had finally, in the particular way that people finally do things, simply set it down. "Thank you," Wren said. It was all there was to say. It was enough. They rode into Silver Creek on February 12th at noon, 3 days before the adjusted deadline. Enough margin to matter. Douglas Crane was in the saloon, which Wren had expected. Men who believe they have already won tend to position themselves where they can receive the confirmation comfortably. He looked up when the four of them came through the door with the particular expression of a man recalibrating, not alarmed yet, merely adjusting. Cormac set the leather satchel on the table in front of him. "Count it," he said. Crane opened the satchel with the deliberate slowness of a man performing confidence. He counted. His expression changed as he counted, not dramatically. Crane was not a man who permitted dramatic expressions, but a subtle shift in the region around his eyes, the look of a man whose calculation has returned an answer he did not expect. He closed the satchel. $3,820, Cormac said. Exact. Paid in full. 3 days before your adjusted deadline. Crane was quiet for a moment. He looked at the satchel. He looked at Wren. Then he reached into his coat and produced the loan documents and set them on the table. And Stellan picked them up without being invited and read them in their entirety before he was satisfied, which took 4 minutes and which Crane endured without comment. "There is one additional matter," Crane said. His voice had recovered its pleasantness. The pleasantness of a man who has been waiting for this moment for a long time. The original loan contract, signed in 1878, bears the signature of an Elwood Marsh as guarantor and ranch representative. Mr. Marsh was, at that time, an employee of the ranch, not an owner or legal representative. Under territorial law, a contract signed by an unauthorized party is voidable at the lender's discretion. He smiled the smile of a man who has been holding a card for a very long time and is finally setting it on the table. "I am exercising that discretion. The contract is void, which means the ranch itself was never valid collateral, which means ownership is in question, which means the water rights revert to dispute. And I, as the party with the strongest territorial claim filed in Helena in October, take precedence." The saloon was very quiet. Stellan set the loan documents back on the table. He reached into his coat and took out his notebook. Not the small daily one. A larger one, dark-covered, its pages thick with years of careful annotation, margin notes in 3 colors of ink. He opened it to a page near the back and set it flat on the table beside the loan documents. He did not raise his voice. "Montana Territory Statute 1872, Section 9, Article 4, he said. "A contract rendered voidable due to unauthorized signatory is void in its entirety. This includes all derivative clauses, all collateral designations, all penalty provisions, and all rights claimed by the lender under the contract's terms." He looked at Crane steadily. "You cannot use a void contract to claim the ranch. You cannot use a void contract to claim the water rights. You cannot use a void contract to claim anything at all. The voidability runs both directions, Mr. Crane. If the contract is invalid, your lien is invalid. Your adjusted deadline is invalid. Your water rights claim is invalid." Crane looked at the notebook. He looked at Stellan. "You're not a lawyer," he said. "No," Stellan said. "I'm a man with 7 years of evenings and a thorough library." He closed the notebook. "But I'd be delighted to have a territorial judge review my analysis, if you'd like to pursue this further." The silence that followed was the silence of a man understanding that the ground he had been standing on was not nearly as solid as he had believed. The territorial marshal, who had been sent for before Crane arrived, Stellan had written to request his presence 2 weeks earlier, along with a document from the Helena Land Office regarding fraudulent lien filings, came through the saloon door at that moment. He had, in his possession, papers confirming that the lien Crane had filed in October contained material misrepresentations about the original contract's validity. Crane looked at the marshal. He looked at Stellan. He looked at the satchel of money on the table, which he could no longer claim, and the loan documents, which were void, and the 4 people standing across the table from him who had, by some combination of skill and stubbornness and the willingness to drive a wagon across a Montana mountain in February with a broken axle, arrived at this moment with everything they needed. He picked up his gloves. He left. Outside the saloon windows, the people of Silver Creek who had gathered to watch moved back to make room for him to pass, and not one of them spoke to him as he went. The saloon was quiet. Then the bartender, a heavy-set man named Cordell, who seemed to know the Hargrove brothers by name, refilled 3 glasses without being asked and set them on the bar and said nothing at all. Stellan put his large notebook back inside his coat. Wren looked at him. 7 years, she said. Not continuously, he said. In the evenings, when there was time. You knew he might do this. I knew someone might do something like this, Stellan said. The ranch has water rights that downstream properties depend on. That has always been a vulnerability. Knowing a thing might happen is not the same as knowing how to stop it. I spent those 7 years learning how. Birch made a sound that was almost a laugh. It was quiet and brief, but it was unmistakably the sound of a man who has been waiting for this exact moment for some time, and is privately delighted that it has arrived. Cormac looked at his middle brother with an expression that contained several years' worth of retrospective understanding rearranging itself into a new configuration. You could have told me, he said. You would have told me to stop, Stellan said. You would have said it was unnecessary and that we would find another way. A long pause. Yes, Cormac said. I would have. And we might not have, Stellan said quietly. Found another way. Another pause. Buy me a drink, Cormac said. Stellan moved to the bar. Mrs. Adeline Vetch, who had apparently followed the proceedings from a table near the back of the room, where she had been nursing a cup of tea for the better part of an hour, stood up. She crossed the room. She stopped in front of Wren. She held out her hand. Wren took it. I may have been hasty in my first assessment, Mrs. Vetch said. She said it the way a woman says something when she has practiced it on the walk over and is determined to get through it without revision. I appreciate that, Wren said. Mrs. Vetch nodded once, squeezed her hand, and released it. Then she turned and walked out of the saloon with the posture of a woman who has done her duty and is satisfied with the result. Cormac watched her go. Something that was almost a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. It stayed there. The ranch was quiet that evening. Outside, the temperature had dropped with the sunset, but inside the fire was high. The good fire, the kind that fills a room completely. And the 4 of them sat around the table in the warmth with no urgency left in the room for the first time since November. Cormac set a cup of coffee in front of Wren. She looked at it. No sugar. A small amount of salt. The way she had been making it since Boston. The way that was entirely particular to her and had never been requested or explained and had certainly never been taught to anyone in this cabin. She looked up at him. He said nothing. He sat down across from her with his own cup and looked at the fire, and the not saying was its own complete sentence. The sentence of a man who has been paying attention since the beginning and has been waiting for the right moment to show it. Birch came in from the barn, where he had gone to check on Capper, who had been unsteady the previous day and was, according to Birch's report, considerably improved. He sat in his chair near the hearth. He reached into his coat and set something on the table beside Wren's coffee. It was the wedding ring quilt, folded carefully, brought back from Helena by Constance Aldrich's rider, who had delivered it to the ranch that afternoon with a short note that said only, "This belongs there." Wren touched the edge of it. The fabric was warm from being inside Birch's coat. Stellan opened his notebook to the last written page and turned it toward her. The page held one line in his careful, precise hand. 3 reasons, enough to begin a new chapter. Wren looked at the coffee, at the quilt, at the 3 men around this table who had, without ever saying so directly, arranged themselves around her work and her hours and her cold fingers and her particular way of taking coffee, as though she had always been here, as though the shape of the house had always had her in it. She thought of a stone orphanage on Waverly Street, of a library reading room on a cold October morning, of a letter written in 3 different hands that had, folded in a plain envelope with a train ticket and $50, changed the entire direction of her life. She thought of Nora Hargrove, who had written a message in a Bible 3 years before the right person arrived to read it, and had trusted that someone would come, who had believed, even in dying, that love finds its way to the people it belongs to if you leave the door open long enough. She picked up the coffee. She drank it. It was exactly right. That night, for the first time since November, Wren did not lock her bedroom door. She stood with the key in her hand for a moment, looking at the lock, and then she set the key on the bedside table beside the Bible and left the door as it was, not open, simply unlocked. It was a small thing. It was also the most deliberate thing she had done since the night she walked into this cabin in a blizzard and chose to stay. She lay down on the quilt. The wedding ring quilt was folded at the foot of the bed where Birch had placed it. She reached down and pulled it up over her and felt the warmth of it settle around her. The same dense warmth of the first quilt she had slept under on the first night in November. And she thought about the fact that the work of her hands was now keeping her warm, and that this was a kind of circle, the kind of circle you cannot plan, only recognize when you find yourself inside it. She reached over and picked up the Bible. She held it in both hands in the dark and thought about a woman who had written a message for a stranger and then arranged a room and placed a candle and chosen flowers, and left a key. She thought, "I understand what you were doing." She thought, "I understand what you meant by worth it." She set the Bible down. Outside she could see from her window the top of Harrow Peak against the sky, the notch at the crown that Birch had pointed out on the 8th evening, standing behind her at the kitchen window in the first real conversation they had had. The mountain had not changed. She had. She closed her eyes. In the morning, when she came into the kitchen, all 3 of them were already there. Cormac was at the stove with the particular focused attention he brought to anything involving fire. Stellan was at the table with his notebook open, though he was not writing. Birch was at the window, looking out at the yard, at the fence, at the mountains beyond. The table was already set. 4 places. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it. 4 plates, 4 cups, 4 sets of cutlery, aligned with the precision that was specifically Stellan's contribution to the household's aesthetics. It was a small thing, It was also the clearest statement of intent she had ever been offered, clearer than any words, because it had been done before she arrived, before anyone knew she would come into this kitchen and see it and understand what it meant. She went to her place and sat down. Cormac brought the food to the table and sat across from her. Birch came from the window and took his seat. Stellan closed his notebook. They ate. Outside the window, the mountains were doing what they always did, simply being there, steady and enormous and indifferent to the small, warm things happening at their feet. And Wren thought, this is what it is. This is what the word home has been pointing at all her life, without her being able to see what it was pointing toward. A table, 4 places, food made by people who know what you need before you say it. The mountains outside. The mountains, always. Spring came to Silver Creek in April. In Montana, spring was not a season so much as a negotiation. Patches of bare ground appearing in the south-facing slopes, while the north faces held their snow with the stubbornness of things that have been cold for a long time and are not yet convinced that warmth is permanent. But the wildflowers came anyway, small ones first, pushing through the edges of the snowpack with the insistence of things that have been waiting underground all winter and have simply decided that enough is enough. Reverend Aldous came up from Silver Creek on a Wednesday morning with the sky clear and the mountains showing their full height above the tree line. The ceremony was small. It was outside, because Wren had asked for outside and no one had argued, and the yard looked different in April than it had in November. The fence posts standing in ground that was soft rather than frozen. The mountains behind them the color of something beginning rather than something enduring. She stood beside Cormac and said the words that the law required her to say. Her voice was steady. It had always been steady. When she finished, she looked at Stellan. She looked at Birch. Neither of them looked away. Mrs. Adeline Vetch stood among the small group of Silver Creek residents who had come out of curiosity and stayed out of something that was not quite respect yet, but was moving in that direction. And she was, to her own visible surprise, crying. She pressed a handkerchief to her face with the expression of a woman who disapproves of her own tears and is crying anyway, thoroughly and without apology. Wren noticed this and felt something that was not triumph but was adjacent to it, the feeling of a door that has been held closed for a long time finally opening from the other side. Many years later, on an October evening, when the first cold was coming down from the cairn range, and Harrow Peak was showing above the tree line in the particular way it showed in autumn, broader than the others, with the notch at the top like a worn crown. Wren stood on the porch of the cabin and listened to the sounds of the ranch behind her. Voices from the yard, children's voices. The specific quality of argument that is not real argument, but the kind that exists because children need to practice language, and conflict is the most interesting form of it. A dispute about something small and urgent and immediately forgotten. Boots on the porch steps, a hand on her shoulder. Cormac stood behind her, looking at the mountains with the particular expression of a man who has made his peace with a landscape by inhabiting it long enough to understand that it was never against him. A moment later, Stellan appeared at the door, coffee in hand, and leaned against the frame with the ease of a man completely at home in his own life. Not the ease of a man who has never struggled, but the ease of a man who has struggled and come through it and found that what remains is sufficient. Birch came last, walking up from the barn with a small girl on his shoulders, one of the twins, who had her father's dark hair and her mother's complete indifference to being told she could not do things. She was laughing at something Birch had said, which meant Birch had said something, which was still, even after all these years, a small daily miracle that none of them had stopped appreciating. He set her down in the yard, and she ran to join the noise without looking back. He came to stand beside his brothers, 4 people on a porch, the mountains in the last light, the ranch alive with the sounds of a life that had been built rather than given, built from cold and stubbornness and the decision, made in a dark cabin in November with a blizzard at the door, to stay. A small boy ran up the porch steps and wrapped himself around Wren's legs and looked up at her with amber eyes, the warm brown of oak wood in autumn, identical to his father's and his uncle's, the eyes of people who had survived hard things and were not damaged by the surviving, but deepened by it. She looked down at him. She thought of a stone orphanage on Waverly Street and a train ticket and $50 and a letter written in 3 different hands that she had almost thrown away on a cold October morning in a library reading room where she had gone because it was warm and she had nowhere else to be. She thought of a Bible with a message inside it from a woman she had never met, who had prepared a room and placed wildflowers in a tin cup and written a promise in the margins of Scripture, and then trusted the future to make good on it. She bent down and picked the boy up and held him against her shoulder and looked at the mountains. She was loved. She was chosen. She was home. And she had been, she understood now, for a very long time. Longer than she had known it. Longer than she had allowed herself to believe it. From the moment a door had closed behind her in a storm, and a fire had been burning inside, and 3 men with the same amber eyes had looked at her from across a warm room with the careful uncertainty of people who have been waiting for something they could not name. The mountains held the last light, the way they always held it. The boy laughed at something only he could see, and the ranch, built on grief and stubbornness and the particular courage of people who choose to stay, breathed on into the evening, steady and certain and alive.